It's that time of year again, that fall time, which means it's time to return to the Cookie Scouts. This is something I started a few years ago, and so this year I'll be continuing that tradition. I don't exactly know what inspired me to make the Cookie Scouts in the first place, but whatever it was, it doesn't really matter, as once I start something like this, I tend to come back to it the next year, and the next year, and the next year, until an idea as simple as a tank that sells cookies becomes a whole story. So let's continue working on it. Alright, but what are the Cookie Scouts even? Well, they deliver cookies. And while there is a cookie delivery service at all times of the year, the Cookie Scouts are specific to the fall, as they only come out at the beginning of October. You see, cookies are a very big thing around their area during the Halloween season, and so they need a more efficient way of transporting and distributing the cookies to everyone. Not to mention there tends to be quite a few folks who have the habit of stealing anything that's not completely nailed down, and so having some form of protection for the cookies during their long journey is quite important. And so that's how the Cookie Scouts were started. Every year, they transport the cookies from the factory to the local stores, along with delivering some cookies to customers as they go. It's kind of like the biscuity version of an ice cream truck, except it's a tank. Only there is a secret about the Cookie Scouts that they try to hide, as it's a pretty big safety concern, and that's that the tank doesn't actually run, it's merely for show. The only way they actually move is from the blobber in front who's pulling the tank, and he's not very fast, as you can imagine. And so it takes them quite a while to actually deliver the cookies, which can cause the cookies to start to become a bit hard. Though this does help in the marketing for them, as they can then say things like biscuits as hard as a tank, or something along those lines. Also, I can't imagine there's too many sweet things there, so the residents are probably not very picky about that sort of stuff. And you may have noticed that the Cookie Scouts tend to move through fields or places with high grasses, and this is no coincidence. No, they actually do this for a strategic purpose. Imagine if you were just outside, just thinking about some important decision, like whether you should go buy some cookies or not, when you happen to see the Cookie Scout tank slowly being pulled along in front of you. Now it's possible you would still buy cookies from them, but it's also very likely that seeing a tank like that, which can barely move and really doesn't have any form of protection in any way, would not leave a very good first impression, and you may actually end up being discouraged from buying any of their cookies. But now, let's say instead you see in the far off distance, like somewhere in the golden glow of the wheat fields at sunset, the glowing silhouette of a tank moving through the fields. You may still be unsure of buying cookies from them, but the initial impression would likely be that of wonder or amazement. At least, that's the marketing strategy that the Cookie Scouts are going for. As long as they can stay far away, they can hide a lot of their flaws, like hiding the fact that their tank is being pulled along by having the puller be hidden under the tall grasses of the wheat fields. This way they can create a much more impressive first appearance. At least that's the main idea. But there's also another reason they choose to stay in the fields and avoid any kinds of dense shrubbery or closely packed forests. You see, when you're on top of a tank in the middle of a field, you have a good range of vision. You can scan your surroundings for miles, and if there's someone or something headed your way, you'll either see them or the wheat moving wildly as they attempt to navigate it. And so, it's for this reason that it's very hard to sneak up on the Cookie Scouts, which is very important as there's a lot of thieves in their area. Oh yeah, and you may also be wondering what's in the tank itself. And honestly, it's a pretty nice place. They've really cleaned it out, and they have some nice furniture in there. It is admittedly a bit small and cramped, but there's usually no more than 2 or 3 Cookie Scouts in there at a time, so they have enough room. They can also spend the night in there if they fail to reach their destination, which does happen quite a bit. Again, these guys are not the speediest of deliverers, and the areas they travel is quite large in range, so it usually takes multiple days to drop off all of their cookies. Luckily, they don't have any sort of be there in 5 days or left policies, or else they'd definitely be out of business long ago. Anyways, I think that's everything you really need to know about the Cookie Scouts. Sometimes they do get into a bit of a disagreement about things like who will be the driver or who's pulling for the day, but that's to be expected. The life of a Cookie Scout is a cruel one, and for the most part, they make the best of it. So now, I think it's best to go over the design for this thing. Okay, so let's talk about the previous artwork they made in the other years. You'll see in this first one, the color for the tank was actually a dark green, and it had some pink ribbons around it. It also had a big stack of cookies on it, but as you can probably guess, this is not the safest way to transport cookies, and so that was changed later on. In the second one, this is the first time that the tank is now pink. I did this because I really imagined that this Cookie Scout tank has some form of pink on it, but having a pink tank and pink ribbons just didn't really work. It was too much pink. So as such, I decided to just scrap the idea of the ribbons altogether. Although really, this kind of bothered me as I do really think they should have some form of ribbon on them. And so for the next one, the one for 2023, I again made the tank pink. But for this year's one, I just couldn't do it anymore. I needed the pink ribbons. So then there was the question, what color would the tank be? I didn't want it to be a dark green like the original. I didn't think the dark green really fit. Also, since they were going to be in wheat fields, a dark green really doesn't blend in with the fall environment. So then of course there's the option of going for that golden tan color, but I felt like that would actually blend in with the wheat too much. Again, they want to be noticeable. They're not actually doing this for a war. They don't want to be completely hidden in the fields. So then, that left only one other possibility that I could think of. You see, when you're drawing art, you really want to use a limited amount of colors. So for this picture, there is that grayish blue sky, the golden tan of the fields, and then the pink. And that's really the three colors I want there to be. I don't want to incorporate another color because that's going to be a bit too much. So then, that really only leaves the color of the tank should be a grayish blue. And honestly, I think it works pretty well. It's not too bright, but it's distinct from the fields. And I think this is the color I'm going to be using going forward. And of course, it just allows me to use pink ribbons, which as you can probably tell is a very important thing to me. The Cookie Scouts absolutely must have pink ribbons. And then of course, about the cookies, I didn't want them to be stacked up, because again, that's a bit dangerous. So this time, I decided to go with a big net on the back, which can hold all their cookie boxes. I also generally tried to improve the tank shape a bit. I'm not exactly into drawing military vehicles, if you couldn't tell, but I still tried to do my best to make it more accurate. One thing that I didn't add, which I really liked from last year's picture, were like these cinnamon bun pumpkins and the crop circles. I just couldn't fit the cinnamon bun pumpkins in this picture. It just felt a bit too crowded that way, but I definitely want to reuse that idea. And as for the crop circles, I feel like there could be a whole thing with that. I don't exactly know how I want to do it, but next year I think the crop circles are going to play a big part. As I usually like to do, I like to take something and then kind of mix it with something else. And I feel like mixing crop circles with something else could work very well. I don't really know what it'd be yet. I know right now, crop circles are kind of associated with aliens, but I'm thinking like, maybe the crop circles are being made by something else. Whether it's a natural phenomenon, or a creature that's making them, I feel like there could be some story there. I don't really know if that would have anything to do with the Cookie Scouts, maybe a completely different theme, but as it's kind of in the same area, they might connect somehow. I'm not sure. I don't want to think about this too much, because then I'm going to want to start working on it, and I want to save this for next year. But yeah, that's definitely what I'm going to do next year, so be ready for that. Oh yes, and one more thing, I also improved the wheat this year. I didn't like how my wheat looked last year. It was way too soft and blurry. Honestly, the only thing I really needed to change to make the wheat better was to add noise. Like, if you look at it, all it is there's a lot of like grain to it. I don't mean grain like the wheat grain, but I mean like the noise grain, static, a lot of little bits and particles. I just added a lot more of that with like some textured brushes, and it really just makes it look a lot more like wheat, and a lot more fluffy too. I also used more gray on the top of the wheat to make it look lighter. Oh yeah, that's another thing. If you're trying to make a bunch of plants together, a lot of the time what ends up happening is it will turn gray. I don't entirely know why that is. I think it's because there's a lot of lights and darks all being mixed together, so it just kind of forms gray, and it removes a lot of the color from it, but it honestly makes things look very fluffy. So if you're having trouble making something look fluffy, think about just turning it gray and desaturated. Anyways, I think that's actually it for this picture. It definitely turned out better than the last ones, and I'll have to see what happens to it next year.